World War II gave rise to the highest concentration of pilots the world had ever seen. So it stands to reason that many of the greatest pilots of all time came from this era. Many pilots who fought in the war, notably Chuck Yeager, rose to prominence after the war, but not during. And many pilots, like Eric Alfred Hartmann, were legendary during the war, but during the war only. But there is one instance of a man whose modest career as an unremarkable pilot eventually evolved into what was arguably the greatest and most successful career a pilot could ever live. His name was Eric Brown. Eric Brown was born in January of 1919 in Scotland to a pilot of Britain's Royal Flying Corps during World War I. At a very young age, Brown expressed an interest in flight and aviation, being taken up into the air by his father as early as 8. His first interaction with Germany, a nation he would eventually find himself waging war against, came in the form of the 1936 Berlin Olympics. While in Germany, Brown and his father found themselves mingling in the social groups of pilots from the newly formed German Air Force, the Luftwaffe. Among the Luftwaffe's early leadership was Ernst Udet, a fighter pilot from the previous war whose kill count rivals that of the Red Baron. It was Udet that inspired Brown to both take up a career as a pilot and learn German, two skills that would serve him well over the course of the war. It was only a few years after his meeting with Brown that Udet committed suicide, likely due to the strain put on him by the Nazi Party and Hermann Goering, the Luftwaffe's leader. Brown was an exchange student in Germany in September of 1939 when the war began. After 3 days of incarceration, he was allowed to return to Britain, possibly due to his friendship with Ernst Udet. Already more experienced in aviation than most young men his age, Brown enlisted in the Fleet Air Arm as a pilot, initially serving aboard the HMS Audacity as a fighter pilot. During his time aboard the Audacity, Brown shot down 2 German maritime patrol aircraft, his only kills during the war. But how could it be that one of the alleged greatest pilots of all time only got 2 kills over the course of the entire war? His career in combat, perhaps fortunately, was cut short in 1941 when the Audacity was sunk by a German submarine. Over the course of the night, pilots, engineers, and sailors succumbed to exposure, succumbed to their wounds, were shot by Germans, or eaten by sharks. Brown was the sole survivor of the Audacity sinking. It was after this harrowing experience that Brown entered the career he would become famous for, test flight. Given that his squadron was entirely wiped out, Brown's new job as a pilot involved evaluating captured Italian and German aircraft. This eventually evolved into the testing of experimental British aircraft, as well as evaluating on American aircraft to provide feedback on American air doctrine and to see how it can influence British air doctrine. Brown performed test flights and evaluations on every foreign aircraft that entered British hands for the remainder of the war. Brown's exploits, however, do not end with the German surrender. Most interviews of German fighter aces and Luftwaffe higher-ups, including Hermann Goering, the man that possibly drove Ernst Udet to suicide, were conducted by Brown, as many of these individuals would only open up to a fellow pilot on information regarding German Wunderwaffen, experimental aircraft ranging from primitive jets to flying wing technology to near-death traps like the Me-163, a literal rocket with wings. Most of these bizarre machines were eventually flown by Brown, undaunted by the deaths and horrific injuries of other British test pilots who flew these aircraft. Following the war, the quantum leap of German technology led to a race, even between Western powers, to achieve new heights for aviation. As for Britain, it was a close race with the United States to land a jet on an aircraft carrier, initially thought to be suicidal until it was achieved by Brown in 1945. A list of Brown's exploits include, but are not limited to, operating 487 different kinds of aircraft, a world record, over 2,500 successful carrier takeoffs and landings, also a world record, the first pilot to land a twin-engine aircraft on a carrier, the first pilot to land a jet on a carrier, and he is also the only known case of being the sole survivor of a capital ship's destruction during World War II.